Welcome to Globe Watch with me, Charles Ebune. Regional leaders of the Lake Chad Basin Commission affected by the Boko Haram conflict have been meeting in the Nigerian capital, Abuja, joined by French President Francois Hollande and other international actors such as the United States of America and Great Britain. The discussion has been centered on making Boko Haram history, thereby ending the humanitarian crisis created by the conflict and by the existence of the terrorist organization. On the field, the situation is simply tragic. At least 7 million people need humanitarian assistance in the area, and over 2.2 million others are displaced, thus making the work of humanitarian agencies practically extremely difficult. This at a time when the humanitarian movement across the world is facing severe challenges in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad. So, what are the challenges facing humanitarian agencies helping to provide hope for those who have been displaced? My guest today is the Central Africa Regional Bureau Chief of the International Committee of the Red Cross, one of the historic humanitarian agencies in the world. Simon Peter Brooks, welcome to Globe Watch.
It's a great pleasure, Charles.
I just want to get from you, from a statistical point of view, what is the situation of humanitarian assistance today?
In terms of Cameroon, I could say that if we talk about the Lake Chad Basin region, it's critical. We are, if you like, a sector which is subject sometimes to the vagaries of political decision making in capitals which are far away from contexts such as this one. We have to play a role in terms of convincing donors who fund us to do the sorts of activities and the programs we do here to give us this money. And obviously, as you say yourself, this is a moment in the world's history where humanitarian need as a result of conflict is growing exponentially. And as a consequence, there is a limited range of resources that people can give, for example, to Syria, to Yemen, to Afghanistan, to the Lake Chad region basin as well. So the need outstrips, unfortunately, the availability of resources, and it's, I think, true of almost any context that you will find in which you will find the ICRC.
Most regional capitals, Abuja, N'Djamena, Yaoundé, Niamey, and others have been calling on donors across the world to increasingly support them in order to meet up with the humanitarian crisis created by Boko Haram in particular. Nigeria's business tycoon, Aliko Dangote, just announced that he is providing $10 million. That should be roughly 6 billion CFA francs to support victims of Boko Haram. Does that in any form a source of hope for a humanitarian agency like the Red Cross?
Well, of course. I mean, traditionally, I think something around 87 to 93% of our funding comes to us from key governments. I mean, there are a range of key donors who provide us with our funding. I think this has to do with our particular status under the Geneva Conventions as a humanitarian actor. And obviously, those sources, as I demonstrated a moment ago, are becoming stretched, given the number of crises that we are facing. And conflict is becoming infinitely more challenging to deal with, both in a political sense, but in a humanitarian sense as well. I mean, to have access to people in need is not as evident as it was, say, 20 years ago when I first started with the ICRC in Afghanistan. Our acceptance was significant. So, you know, the extent to which you're getting wealthy individuals, I think they call them high value individuals who are able to commit larger amounts of money to the cause of humanitarian need. This is laudable, and this is something that we ourselves are trying to encourage in terms of donations to our organization. So it is a moment, Charles, where I think we need to look beyond governments in a sort of reactive way to ask them for money and to engage other resources and commitment on the part of other people, because at the end of the day, the needs are outstripping the resources. And if you go to northern Cameroon, and you look at the needs, you look at the displacement, you look at the conditions that people are living under, or the prisons in which they're being held. It's tragic, and yet we need to play our part to try and alleviate the suffering.
Oh, you just said that those conditions are tragic. The last time I sat in this same place talking was with the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Mora, and you were just beside when he was granted the interview, and he told me that the Red Cross is facing severe challenges today. Can you prioritize them in terms of delivery as they are today? You just described the situation in the northern part of Cameroon, probably Nigeria, as tragic.
I think probably the greatest challenge for humanitarian access today, aside from sort of the adequacy of resources that we need to do our work, is also this question of access. Conflict, violence today is becoming, I think, in some ways more extreme, more indiscriminate, and unfortunately, the fact is, the statistics will tell you that humanitarian actors today are becoming more implicated as victims. But our ability, for example, if I take an example in Cameroon, our ability to go to Kolafata or to photocall on a regular basis, and we should be able to do this, we want to be able to do this, is restricted by a security environment which limits us to do it. And the level of acceptance of my institution as a neutral, independent, and impartial actor is something that we cannot be sure about, to the extent that I can say to these teams, go.
What actually do you need from governments within which you are carrying your operations? Last time, a few weeks ago, I was talking with the ambassador of the United States of America to the United Nations, Samantha Power, who was saying that you have at least 7 million people affected in the Lake Chad Basin commissions because of Boko Haram. The Cameroonian opposition leader, Kawala, spoke of about 150,000 internally displaced people in Cameroon who need assistance. What do you expect from governments to enable you do your work easily in these challenging times?
Okay, well, I mean, I think I have to say, and it's something that I have said, and I say this from a perspective of a neutral and impartial actor, but the government of Cameroon has facilitated our ability to go out and do what we want to do, what we need to do, whether it's for displaced persons. You talk about 150, some people talk about 160,000 of these people in Cameroon alone. So we're talking about displaced populations. We're talking about resident populations that are hosting these people. You imagine the pressures in an economic environment which has been constricted by war. But we're also talking about our ability to access places of detention where security detainees are being held, not just those from Nigeria, but also those from Central African Republic as well. So the willingness of the government is what we need. We need that support for us to be able to go and do this work. But beyond Cameroon, we also, we can only encourage governments to provide more focus on the crisis in the Lake Chad Basin region. Now, I think in Abuja, we've had these talks between the heads of state, and these sorts of things I think are important, and that leaders from overseas come forward. Because there is sometimes, Charles, this impression we have certainly from those of us who are on the field, is that the allocation of resources to meet humanitarian needs sometimes need to be better balanced. A lot can quite often go to high-profile political regions in the world at the expense of a region like the Lake Chad Basin, for example. I mean, if you take the Middle East.
Do you have the impression that, considering the nature of what is going on in the Lake Chad Basin Commission, the nature of what is going on in the Middle East, specifically in Syria and Iraq, do you think you have been working in the humanitarian field for over 16 years now? Do you have the impression or a sense of feeling that there is a kind of discrimination when it comes to allocating resources in these humanitarian crisis hit areas, that some regions are favored at the expense of others?
It's hard to describe it as discrimination, so no, I wouldn't want to say that. But I mean, if you take
misplaced priorities?
Not even that, I don't think. I think it is simply, it's sort of, where are the political interests, where are the domestic interests of donor nations? For example, Charles, if we take Syria, what do we have in Europe today? We have a refugee crisis. I mean, we have a lot of migration which is going in through the southern underbelly, if you like, of Europe. And I think it's a much more tangible humanitarian challenge for Europe. And so therefore, there is a lot of focus. There is a lot of media focus. I mean, I applaud you for your ability to take a broader perspective and to promote that. But sometimes I think, political interests get caught up, if you like, in the media cycle, the media circus sometimes, if I could do that. So it's not, I don't think it's something which is done on purpose to neglect. But because there are limited resources, it's difficult sometimes to balance and to recognize.
There has been a to and fro movement, especially at the Minawao camp in the far north region of the country, where you have thousands and thousands of refugees from northeastern Nigeria, from parts of Chad and other areas because of the Boko Haram violence. The Etarikosin, the World Food Program Executive Director, has been there. There has been a lot of international focus. Even the former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, visited the area. You have been on the field. Do you think the situation is better today there in terms of taking care of the refugees?
I think, I would say yes and no. I mean, I think that the plight of refugees is being better understood, and resources, I think, humanitarian actors, particularly in Cameroon, are now, if you like, focusing and allocating in a more effective way, which wasn't the case, I think, about a year ago. And let's not forget, Charles, this is a relatively new context. I mean, everybody, you find inexperience across the board. My own organization, we've been really operational at a high operational tempo for the last year or so, and it's the same with other actors. For the government, it's a new conflict. There are challenges for the government. So, on the refugee crisis, from what we can see, this is a subject which is of intense discussion between various governments. I believe UNHCR is also involved in those discussions, and there's a willingness to manage. Now, does that mean that the interests of refugees are always taken into account? Not necessarily. And we have been pleading for, as part of this repatriation process, which we're not involved in, to the extent that we're transferring refugees, but we are saying that where they are being transferred by the government or whomever, that it's done under humane conditions.
Well, I know that the Red Cross will always like people to be treated as human beings in the best possible conditions. You just said that there has been an aspect of inexperience based on the fact that this is a new conflict, not only for the governments in the region, but equally for humanitarian agencies operating to provide assistance. You see, each time I take the newspaper, each time I watch television, each time I listen to the radio, I go on the internet, I see huge amounts of money contributed by individuals, organizations, and whatsoever to better the conditions of the refugees. You have been talking and meeting with these guys. When you see the way they are treated, the refugees, do you have the impression that the resources allocated reach them?
Well, look, if you look at the operation of repatriation of, and they're not just all refugees.
Do you think that there is enough transparency?
Well, again, Charles, the big problem for us is to have access to these transfers. I mean, if, for example, a group of refugees is transferred from Fotokol down to Adamawa state in Nigeria, for example, how can we be present when this happens if we cannot have access? And for us, it is about gaining access to be able to work, to work and to understand. We are an agency, and one of the few agencies that says we must be present. We must be present beside what we would term the victim, if you like. We don't like to use implementing partners to do our work for us. Why? Because we feel we have a responsibility to understand the situation and to advocate and to act in the interests of those persons affected. So it's very difficult for us to know exactly what are the conditions and what are the processes of the repatriation process if we can't get access. So what we say to governments is, look, we understand that this is a political decision, as it is in Europe, by the way. Repatriation of refugees is a political decision, so we're not going to stand there and say this is wrong. But what we say is that when it happens, this should be done under humane conditions. And that's really the point.
What in reality makes accessibility difficult?
It's, well, Charles, for us, it is important to be able to speak to both sides of a conflict. Sometimes to the many parties of the conflict.
You will not have access to talk to the boys of Abubakar Shekau. You will not have access to talk to the boys of Abubakar al-Baghdadi. You will not have the chance of talking to the boys of Abu Musa al-Zakawi. You will not have the chance of talking to the boys of Ghdani, those who lead Al-Qaeda in Somalia. But you have the chance of talking to governments who give you access. Governments giving you access to talk with this guy? Because probably if you have a prisoner exchange, okay, Boko Haram has to liberate 50 Cameroonian refugees in exchange of maybe, say, 25 Chibok girls. You will never meet those guys, sure.
Well, I mean, we've been involved in those sorts of negotiations in this part of the world. I won't go into the details, but I think it is clearly understood by all what it means to be a neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian actor, and that means that this is about a means to an end, and that is to have access to those people that we need to go out and whose interests we need to serve. So, to be truly effective, to have the access to go deep, if you like, into a conflict, traditionally we have to have a dialogue with all parties concerned. And part of that dialogue, Charles, is not simply about getting access, but it's also about the respect for the laws of war. There are elements of the Geneva Conventions, of international humanitarian law, which is designed for the protection of those persons not participating, the wounded, those incarcerated in prisons, to protect their interests and to ensure a certain level of humanity. Now look, two problems. One is a lack of experience, which says that we need to go out and promote this law to arms carriers, on both sides if possible, to governments, to communities, etc., etc. And also it is about sort of saying, well, okay, we need to be accepted, not supporting one side or the other, but it is about supporting the person who's
open a
most in need.
humanitarian corridor.
Now, that clearly, Charles, by logical deduction, if we cannot go to Fotokol on a daily basis or to Kolafata, that would suggest that the respect for our mandate is not how do I say, complete at this stage of the game.
If you were to sit in a table with world leaders, you are directly covering the Lake Chad Basin Commission. I spent the other day online watching the comments of UN Humanitarian Coordinator for the Sahel, Toby Lanza, describing the situation, how dire, difficult, and excruciating it is. He spent the whole day on Twitter tweeting that if you were to sit in a table with President Biya, President Buhari, President Idris Deby, as a humanitarian agency with an undisputable reputation in the domain, what will you tell them that, please, this is what we need first?
What we need...
Concerning the area of operation.
What we need, I think, first and foremost, is to ensure that international humanitarian law is fully respected and implemented. Now, this is an obligation which exists. And the first common article of the 4 Geneva Convention says that the law must be respected, but they must make efforts to ensure that it is respected as well. De faire respecter, as we'd say in French. So that would be the first thing. I mean, you know, the absence of respect for international humanitarian law is a source of significant suffering around the world. The fact that civilians are targeted, the fact that people are incarcerated and are not accorded their basic rights, the fact that health centers are attacked, etc., etc. I mean, the point that you made, I think, in your introduction, if these things were enforced better, there would be infinitely less suffering across the world.
The cases go from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen. I don't know whether it will be Nigeria, Cameroon next, because in the war of drones, probably it's difficult to do without such kind of situations. When you look at what happened with Médecins Sans Frontières, people like Oxfam Chief Executive for the UK, Christian Forsyth, have been very critical of such actions. Do you think the humanitarian movement is under attack? Are you scared working for the humanitarian agency?
I don't think we're under attack. I do think that part of it, Charles, is just the nature of modern conflict. I mean, you don't have these defined battle lines on one side and on the other you've got these sort of pre-existing armies. I mean, you know, the front line of a conflict can change from Maroa one day to Fotokol the next, etc. I mean, it's very dynamic. So I don't think that, you know, that humanitarians are under attack. I just think that it's becoming more of a challenge to say, how do we operate? How do we remain relevant in terms of what is it we're about? Alleviating suffering and ensuring respect for the dignity of those persons who are not or no longer participating in conflict. Again, as you said, you know, those persons, about 2.4 million people, I think Ambassador Powers was talking about, you know, who are in need. So there is a tremendous amount of suffering, but the access that we do not enjoy today vis-a-vis, say, 20 years ago when I first started, is noticeable. We've got to find ways of having a dialogue with the actors. And at this stage of the game, it's proving quite difficult.
Oh, well, finally, you just said that we need to find a space to get the actors behave well. The challenges are just so many. If you have to quantify the assistance you need, especially for the Lake Chad Basin area, how will you quantify it and qualify it? How much do you need? Look, there is somebody who is just waiting for you to pronounce a figure and he provides all of that money.
Yeah.
Can you quantify and qualify it?
Well, the other thing too, Charles, is simply our capacities. You know, the ICRC is going through a phase now, what we would term institutional operational growth. And that means our ambition is to probably increase our workforce from 15 to 16,000 by next year. This means that we see more need, and there is more need, but you know, we're bringing in people into our organization who need to be developed, who need to be coached, who need to be trained in order to have the experience to go out and do what is sometimes a very technically a very challenging job in very difficult circumstances. So yes, resources I think are one thing, but I think an institutional an institution needs to be able to grow in a way that it remains relevant and it produces work of a high quality. And that's something that the humanitarian sector...
Can you give me a financial figure you need that can stabilize the humanitarian situation in the Lake Chad Basin?
Yeah, I mean, in the Lake Chad region...
20 billion?
I don't
$122 billion?
You know, it's something I'd like to be able to answer. I mean, the UN would have one opinion. You speak about Toby Lanza. I'm sure he has a figure which is infinitely greater than mine.
Oh.
But I would say for us here in Cameroon, if we were to be somewhere over 20 million Swiss francs, which is sort of about $23 million, you know, we would be at a point where we would be quite a relevant actor. But that doesn't exclude that we would need the UN and other actors to be playing their part.
Sure.
So, you know, look, we're throwing darts here, Charles, you know.
Absolutely. The Central Africa Regional Bureau Chief of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Simon Peter Brooks, thank you very much indeed for being guest on Global Watch.
Charles. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.